Today we've got yet another remake of an old video. We're taking on the magnetic duo of Magneton and Magnezone, but we're also adding Sandy Shocks. Aside from being Jesse Pinkman's favorite evolutionary line, Magneton has been around since Gen 1, notably featuring in the darkly offbeat episode Sparks Fly for Magnemite, while also featuring in minor roles such as Mewtwo Strikes Back, The Power of One, The Legend of Thunder, and Lucario and the Mystery of Mew. It's a favorite for such roles, it seems. Then in Generation 4, Magneton evolved into Magnezone when leveled up in Mount Coronet and its Stalker-esque zone of special magnetism. We've got a Magneton to get through today, so let's get in the Magnezone. No, we're not sorry. And ask, how great were Magneton, Magnezone, and Sandy Shocks actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. With good defense, excellent special, decent speed, and a great stab in Thunderbolt, Magneton seemed like it had some solid tools for success in the first generation. The problem? It was completely and utterly hapless into ground and grass types. The latter it could at least paralyze with Thunder Wave, but the Double Edge and Hyper Beam it shoehorned into its moveset were, for lack of better options, not anything that was actually threatening the opponent. It was better to have them than not, of course, but they were just so unthreatening off that meager base 60 attack stat. Plus, Magneton's nice defensive stats on both sides of the spectrum were let down by its awful base 50 HP, so it wasn't much of a hit taker. It had its upsides, but they weren't sufficient to compensate for its flaws. Forget OU, it couldn't muster a niche in UU, and was rare even in NU, where it had to compete with Electrode. Sure, Magneton hit a lot harder, but Electrode was much faster and had the amazing explosion in its moveset. Plus, that higher speed stat translated to a much higher critical hit rate, in effect making even its Thunderbolt stronger quite often. Magneton had its niche, of course. Its high special made it an apt hit taker, resilient in the face of big hits like Mr. Mime, Charizard, and Moltres. Moltres' Fire Blast, tied for the strongest special move in the whole game, was only a 2-hit kill 20% of the time, while Magneton of course hit its targets incredibly hard in return. With this bulk in mind, Magneton also didn't have to entirely rely on its speed, meaning it wasn't as afraid of taking Thunder Waves. However, it just wasn't nearly as consistent in battle as Electrode, so it wasn't used nearly as often, and thus its usage dropped so low that it wasn't a true NU Pokemon, instead becoming untiered. Magneton was definitely not a bad Pokemon in its debut generation, but its flaws were difficult to overcome. Generation 2 added Magneton's half-steel typing that is so strongly identified with. It's strange to picture it having been pure electric in Gen 1. Anyway, with this addition came a bundle of useful resistances. The special stat splitting in two meant that Magneton's new special defense was quite meager, but it would still hit quite hard. Furthermore, the addition of hidden power was enormous, allowing Magneton to hit the dreaded ground types. Its stats weren't enough to make it OU, but it became quite an excellent UU Pokemon. It got plenty of opportunities to switch in against staples like Haunter and Granbull, and from there it proceeded to scare a great deal of the tier. Many common offensive and defensive Pokemon completely refused to come near it, from the bulky waters Blastoise and the Slow Twins to the more offensive threats Scyther and Dodrio, as well as many others on both sides of the spectrum. Magneton did have its answers, of course, but the most common ones were the ground-type Nidoqueen and Piloswine, the former of which ruled the tier for much of its existence, and both were battered quite decently by HP Water, especially with Spikes down. Magneton was an excellent Spikes abuser since no flying type wanted to switch into it, meaning it pressured every switch in it had. There were more reliable Magwalls like Ampharos and Chansey, but they generally didn't exactly threaten Magneton in return. With Rest and Sleep Talk, Magneton could engage them in a stalemate, burning PP and positioning itself exactly until it was ready for a teammate to switch in safely. Magneton had superb longevity for an offensive threat. In a similar vein, it could deter attempts at progress made aimed at its teammates from another common wall, Hypno, whose Psychic's Mag shrugged off. The only truly safe Magneton answer, who also threatened it in return, was Quagsire, which was definitely decent, but a very specific Pokemon in its own right. Furthermore, Magneton was the sole reason why Scyther, one of the tier's scariest threats, primarily ran HP Ground over the bug that it would otherwise far prefer. Giving Magneton free opportunities was bad news for such a major threat. The same applied to Pinsir, and while Dodrio would have loved to not waste a slot on HP Ground itself, but needed to since his stabs were so badly blanked by Magneton. With such superb offensive and defensive presence, Magneton was a driving force of many teams' success and an excellent Pokemon in Gen 2 UU. Generation 3 is where Magneton as we know it came into existence. The introduction of abilities gave it Magnet Pull, preventing Steel types from switching out against it. Given Steel's major resist-laden defensive presence, of which Magneton itself was an example, being able to trap and damage them was quite significant. Nowhere was it more significant and iconic than against the big bad bird itself, the dreaded wall, Skarmory. This was the gen where Skarmory gained spikes, which now went up to 3 layers as opposed to its previous one, and as a result, Skarmory's already irritating defensive presence now turned into an offensive threat. It was a wall that would slowly hack you to pieces as you failed to break through it. Enter Magneton, whose Magnet Pull prevented Skarmory from running away from its super effective stab Thunderbolt and its Skarm Trap Hyper niche was born. It cannot be overemphasized how important this dynamic is to advance. We've seen Magneton and its evolution target steel flying types in every gen afterwards, but nowhere was it more important than Gen 3, where Skarmory was at the peak of its powers, invalidating many a Pokemon and indeed a team. It was these that most required Magneton to function, ever since the Ruby and Sapphire days where only 200 Pokemon existed, and well into the expanded days of a full 386. Magneton had to watch for getting picked off by the Skarmory user, potentially catching the Mag Switch with Dugtrio, which led to some interesting dynamics, such as Metagross risking giving Skarmory a free layer of spikes by Meteor Mashing it rather than immediately switching into Magneton. But generally, such Dugtrio switches were so risky that Magneton was highly consistent at picking Skarmory off. Plus, Skarmory teams didn't pack Dugtrio more often than they did, so one couldn't always play afraid of it. Magneton's Skarm removal had to be reliable anyway. It made entire team styles viable. The entire genre of physical offense, for instance, was entirely predicated on Magneton being able to get rid of Skarmory, which would otherwise stonewall them into oblivion. These threats, like Metagross, Snorlax, Swampert, Salamence, Gyarados, Heracross, and Celebi, were quite dangerous, but not into Skarm. Not with the sets they wanted to run anyway. Sure, you could run Fire Blast Snorlax to try and wear Skarmory down, but you'd be better off with magging the Skarm and running more generally threatening moves on Lax. Swords Dance Baton Pass Celebi might enable terrifying agility Metagross sweeps, but it doesn't do so with Skarmory around. Dragon Dance Salamence and Gyarados' potential clunks into nothingness with Skarmory around. Even something like DD Tyranitar, which wasn't truly answered by Skarm, loved not having its sweep interrupted by a Whirlwind. The fact that Magneton limited Skarmory's ability to spike was also incredibly useful. A common criticism leveled at Magneton was that it was useless outside of Skarmory trapping, making it matchup prone, but this wasn't entirely accurate. In non-Skarmory matchups, its teammates should revel in the lack of Skarm, so the trade-off should be worthwhile anyway, but even in the non-Skarm matchups, Magneton had plenty of use. The most immediate was Magnet Pull's capacity to trap other steals. With Hidden Power Fire, it could remove Fortress, while it could cripple certain Jirachi with Thunder Wave, a major blow to Wish Protect sets. And in several situations, it could even pick off Metagross. Not from high health, of course, but a popular tactic was to pair Leech Seed Celebi with Magneton, then pivot Substitute Magneton into a Meteor Mash, and spam Substitute until Metagross was in KO range, successfully getting the trap off. If Metagross exploded Magneton on the switch, well, you'd absolutely take a Magneton for a Metagross trade. That was much more advantageous for the Magneton user. This was most reliable alongside substitute variants of Leech Seed Celebi, since Substitute either took advantage of Metagross switching out or provoked it into Meteor Matching so as to not give a free sub, preventing unexpected earthquakes on the Magneton switch and maximizing the chances that you'd get the KO on Metagross, not just trade Magneton for it. And this was made especially reliable because Subseed Celebi also ran Baton Pass. Baton Pass Celebi was generally a great Magneton partner because it could potentially get Magneton in immediately should Skarmory be the initial response. Alternatively, Magneton could swap directly into a Choice Band Meteor Mash with its excellent quadruple resist and good defense and proceed to remove Metagross. This was testament to Magneton's other primary trait, that same steel typing and good defense, providing a superb switch to many common Choice Banded moves, as it also quad resisted Salamence's Hidden Power Flying, and it took 3 of Aerodactyl's 4 moves as well. It was particularly good at switching into them because, with Magneton's lower value in the game, most players wouldn't try to predict it, as they were instead trying to hit the physical wall they expected to come in for max damage, and incidentally, this made Magneton more reliable at staving them off. And while not massive departures from each other, Magneton had several good sets that made it deceptively irritating to deal with in its own right, outside of Skarmory trapping too. Magneton became a go-to after the rise of specially defensive Skarmory to maximize the odds of a Thunderbolt KO, while Charcoal Hidden Power Fire was useful on some teams that similarly wanted to maximize odds of KOing Fortress. Magneton was the more useful by far though. With Toxic, Magneton could be highly irritating to many standard bulky structures, since most of their Pokemon like Tyranitar, Gengar, and filler lasts like Aerodactyl, Salamence, Moltres, and Zapdos didn't like taking Thunderbolt, so it was effective at hindering grounds from switching in, and Hidden Power Grass threatened certain Swampert, thinking it could refresh them off, as well as pressuring Blissey too. With Protect or Substitute, especially alongside Leftovers, it could even force Blissey out and cause some havoc. Thunder Wave was excellent for slowing down faster threats like Jirachi, Celebi, and Salamence, who would otherwise want to boost against it. Sometimes Magneton could even use Endure and Select to turn the tables on would-be revenge kills from Dugtrio. The boosted speed also made it dangerous to take on for frailer offensive teams that couldn't take its hits, but instead tried to take it out with would-be faster Pokemon like Charizard. Eventually, Magneton wasn't just used to get rid of Skarmory, it was also used alongside Skarmory. You know what loves opposing Skarmory KO'd? Yup, your own Skarmory, because Skarmory is often the best switch into Skarmory, and removing an opponent's Spike's immunity, as well as check to your own threats like Aerodactyl, was massively helpful. Magneton wasn't just trapping opposing Skarmory either. With Hidden Power Fire, it removed Fortress that would attempt to spin Skarmory's spikes away, in a sense spin blocking it like Gengar would, and sometimes Magneton was even used to trap opposing Magneton in a Dugtrio-esque gambit. One couldn't always guarantee one's mag would win the mirror match, but with Thunderwave and Hidden Power Fire, as well as support from the Pursuit Tyranitar that was also often on these teams, given how great it was to be able to forcibly remove an opposing Skarmory and Gengar, you'd get the job done and certainly ensure your Skarmory was good to go. And since at this point we know how helpless the other Pokemon mag teams are against Skarmory, preserving Skarmory is certainly worth the sacrifice. Skarm mag teams were massively successful and popular, becoming their own playstyle in the process. This was where Magneton found true consistency, as the frailty of physical offense was often a major hindrance to reliable success. Magneton also began seeing use on bulky teams with Rapid Spin, usually Claydol. These Magdoll teams, as they were called, were an attempt to completely shut standard Spikes teams down by removing the Spiker and then spinning the Spikes away, removing their most significant source of pressure. By going so all in on the anti-Spikes plans, such teams often opened themselves up to matchup issues, but they were incredibly consistent at punishing lazy autopilot team building and playing, and forced a new level of adaptation and alertness in consideration of their presence. Basically, in a metagame so incredibly dominated by Skarmory, being able to forcibly remove it was incredible. It was all about finding the right support cast to best take advantage of the removal. As such, Magneton was, despite its flaws, an incredibly important and defining Pokemon in the third generation of OU. In the age of Generation 4's massive power creep, featuring Life Orb and Choice Specs, which particularly facilitated the new age of Dragon-type power with the buff Outrage and the addition of Draco Meteor, it was mostly only Steel types that could hope to stand in the way of such strength, and as such, Magnezone's Magnet Pull became incredibly useful. Skarmory was its main target, of course. The addition of Shed Shell allowing Skarmory to escape Magnezone's trapping was potentially irritating, but even with the new addition of Roost, the loss of Leftovers was often too major a hindrance to Skarmory's walling ability in this strong new metagame, ensuring Magnezone's consistency in getting its main job done. Skarmory wasn't its only target though. With Magnet Rise, it could avoid Earthquake and pick off Bronzong as well. Jirachi and its newly gained Iron Head irritated much the tier, but with its quadruple resistance to the move alongside solid bulk and Leftovers, Magnezone was capable of removing it nicely. Getting rid of Scarf Jirachi was especially useful for enabling several of its offensive teammates. With Choice Scarf, Magnezone could even act as a perfect revenge killer to Swords Dance Lucario. One couldn't escape from it. However, during the Platinum era and throughout much of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Magnezone was just as important in removing another Steel as it was Skarmory. It excelled in punishing one of the best moves around, Choice Band Scizzor's Bullet Punch, the go-to revenge killing tool for just about everything, especially including Dragon Dance Salamence. Many strategies revolving around Magnezone came to define a significant portion of DPP offense. One such combination involved using it alongside a Gengar with Protect and Hidden Power Fire. Scizzor was commonly used to check Gengar, who was often put in a difficult position. It would want to switch out from Bullet Punch, but risk getting trapped by Pursuit, and staying into Hidden Power Fire on the Pursuit, of course risk getting Bullet Punched. With Protect, this guessing game was eliminated, and Scizzor playing it safe and Bullet Punching would find itself trapped by Magnezone, letting Gengar run loose, and not just Gengar, but that most dangerous threat, Dragon Dance Salamence. The most famous Magnezone strategy though, was pairing it with as many dragons as possible. Magnezone's Steel removal wasn't just useful for dragons of course, as in addition to the aforementioned Gengar, other threats like Metagross, Mamoswine, and Scizzor itself appreciated it as well. However, the dragons were definitely the most powerful. Latias, Salamence, Flygon, Kingdra, they all reveled in freely spamming their dragon stabs once certain Steels had been eliminated. True, Magnezone couldn't remove every Steel, it generally wasn't going near Heatran, most notably, but the ones it removed tended to be the biggest roadblocks to these threats. Heatran wasn't exactly a Salamence check, for instance. This strategy received its own name, Drag Mag. There was even one team that so committed itself to the concept that it ran Magneton in addition to Magnezone alongside all four of these dragons. Known as 4 Drag 2 Mag, it was on the gimmicky side, but the fact that it actually worked was testament to the strategy's inherent power. In addition to trapping Steels, Magnezone could pose quite a threat to stall teams itself, not just by removing the Steel to facilitate its teammates, although that was huge, but also through the Magneton line's newly gained Explosion, which allowed Magnezone to threaten Blissey and put a serious charge in ground types as well, especially if holding Life Orb. With the right hidden power, Magnezone didn't even necessarily need to blow up on ground. While Fire was the standard for the quickest trap against Fortress, Grass was also excellent to lure the highly popular Swampert, or at least ensure it couldn't be used as a check, letting Magnezone threaten something else, like say, Blissey. Even after the bans of Latias and Salamence, Magnezone continued to be used. Dragonite rose to take Salamence's place, while Flygon and Kingdra were bigger than ever. And that's to say nothing of other major threats that loved its support, most notably the newly popular devastating late game sweeper, Offensive Trickroom Bronzong, which also made a fierce pairing with Choice Band Tyranitar, who loved being able to spam Crunch without fearing Skarmory. A Custat Berry Indoor set eventually emerged, allowing it to go beyond its usual limitations by extending its reach beyond its trapping more efficiently against against opposing offense. Staring down a Scarf Flygon about to earthquake you? No problem, endure it. And now you can go first and blow it up. It was massively useful in all sorts of situations and eventually became Magnezone's new standard. Though it was generally synonymous with enabling offensive threats on fast-paced teams, Magnezone began seeing use on more balanced and stall structures. It could still enable threats on those teams like Scarf Flygon, Swords Dance Gliscor, or many variants of Breloom, which gave these teams the flexibility to play more aggressively and thus made them more consistent. The game plan for such zone teams was to take things at a more methodical pace, systematically wearing the opponent down, with Magnezone being a major part of such proceedings due to its ability to force progress through its trapping, while also contributing nicely to such teams' defensive cores with its solid bulk and huge list of resistances. It had many different sets it could run. The first that emerged on such teams became Magnezone's alternative to the Custat Berry standard, and that was Toxic Protect, a classic combination that irritated Grounds and Blissey in equal measure, while also helping Magnezone maximize its lefties recovery and chip damage, as well as scout choice users coming in. After the return of Latias and an ensuing rise in defensive Bronzong usage, Magnezone adapted by swapping out Toxic for Magnet Rise. Metal Sound also saw some use, a rarely seen relic from the Latimense days, where it let Zone destroy Wish Calm Mind Jirachi. Now it allowed Magnezone to completely dominate Calm Mind Clefable. After the Dugtrio ban, Heatran was wreaking havoc on bulky teams of all sorts, and Scarf Magnezone with Hidden Power Ground rose to take it out. It played a sort of Dugtrio role itself in this regard, while also providing its balanced team speed in its slot, as opposed to it needing it everywhere. This speed was helpful in taking on all sorts of faster threats like Gengar, and seeing as the set lost the leftovers that allowed Magnezone to stifle the metagame dominating Wish Protect Jirachi, one of its biggest selling points, this Scarf set also used Thunder Wave, making use of the Rachi trap to guarantee paralysis on it and seriously limit its effectiveness. Speaking of Scarf, this is where Magneton began seeing usage. Yes, Magneton and OU. Wasn't it outclassed by Magnezone's high power and bulk? It could miss those things, yes, and so it was team dependent, but generally, Magneton was strong enough to get the job done against its relevant targets, and crucially, it gained opportunities Magnezone didn't have, because Magnezone actually became slower upon evolving. Magneton's extra speed put it in a very specific, very important speed bracket that gave its Choice Scarf set incredibly important revenge-killing capabilities against the tier's scariest Dragon Dancers, Gyarados and Dragonite, which it outpaced after a dance. It's worth noting that this was the case for Adamant Gyarados and Dragonite only, but Jolly Gyarados was never used, and Jolly Dragonite ceased to exist after Scarf Heatran disappeared from the metagame, and Adamant's increased power became important for breaking bulkier teams. Anyway, given how popular DD spam hyper offense had become, this niche was incredibly useful, and Magneton became a legitimate part of the OU metagame. Also, unlike Magnezone, it outsped Dragonette's Tyranitar. Now, it wouldn't be KOing it from high health like it would Gyarados and Dragonite, but Magneton's stab flash cannon still stung quite a bit, so it was a major benefit. Additionally, Scarf Magneton outsped Starmie, which Scarf Zone did not, and thus the revenge killing option was excellent, given how much of a terror spec Starmie could be. Of course, even with the rise of Magneton, Magnezone was far from outclassed. Even its Scarf set continued to see use, as certain teams preferred its far superior ability to sponge Draco Meters to the extra speed. Non-Scarf Magneton saw some usage, but overall, Magnezone's non-Scarf sets were miles ahead too. Overall, both Mags became important parts of Diamond and Pro OU, with Magnezone being one of the most crucial throughout the entire generation. And we're not quite done with Gen 4 yet though. Funnily enough, Magneton was actually less effective in UU than it was in OU, since it matched up so poorly against the tier Steel types and didn't do well against the non-Steels either. It was quite good in NU though, not so much because of its Steel trapping since, well, it was really the only good Steel type. Instead, it was just a solid Pokemon using its resistances, decent bulk, and excellent power to switch in, which it was quite good at. Given the tier's generally low power level, and once it had hit the field, it proceeded to threaten pretty much the whole tier. Its spec set was particularly vicious. Not only did its Thunderbolt cleave through the incredibly bulky Slowking, it also crushed everything that didn't resist it, including bulky staples like Regirock. The few Pokemon that could take it on, the Grounds, Nidoqueen, Sandslash, Gligar, Golem, and Rhydon, and the Grasses, Cradily, Vileplume, and Meganium, got absolutely destroyed by Flash Cannon, which was quite a spammable move in its own right, given its surprisingly few resists, with several of them being frail Pokemon that get bowled over by its power anyway, and the sturdy Waters Poliwrath, Politoed, and the aforementioned Slowking, of course, being terrified of Thunderbolt. The only decent Pokemon with both the typing, bulk, and recovery to take on both stabs was Quagsire, and guess what else specs Mag packed? Hidden Power Grass, of course. It was a great Pokemon in Gen 4 NU. Finally, it took some time to catch on, but Magnezone eventually became a superb part of DPP Ubers as well. It played similarly to OU, simply removing the Steel, be it Skarmory, Bronzong, Jirachi, or Scizor, and watch the even stronger Dragon moves fly. Removing Skarmory and Bronzong was particularly important because they were the only Pokemon capable of thwarting the mighty Garchomp stab combination. Besides Garchomp, the Soul Doolally twins, Dialga, Palkia, and Rayquaza all loved Magnezone's support, and it wasn't just dragons either. Most notably, setup variants of Groudon loved not having to include Fire Punch or Overheat to take on Skarmory and Bronzong. Plus, in a pinch, Magnezone could help stave off one of the many Draco Meteors whose bombardment was arguably the defining characteristic of the tier. Overall, Magnezone and Magneton had an absolutely incredible Generation 4. Gen 5 Explosion nerf? No problem. As you see, Generation 5 also unleashed more dragons upon the world, and as a defense against these new dragons, it added a new steel type, Ferrothorn, which yes, would fold to Magnezone's hidden power Fire. Oh sure, there were a few goofballs early on who foolishly used Scarf Magnezone and got stalled out by Leech Seed Protect Ferrothorn under rain, but once you establish that the bare minimum for acceptable zone sets was that one could take on Ferrothorn under such conditions, which were quite common and not at all difficult to circumvent, all it took was decent play alongside Substitute to block the Leech Seed, which would even let Magnezone hit the revenge killing switch in afterwards. Some players even used Charge Beam to make the most of this. However, whether it was a subset or the spec set who was so strong that it powered through Ferrothorn even under rain, the point was that Magnezone once again excelled as a steel killer, and for that reason, Dragmag was one of the most anticipated, feared non-weather strategies right off the bat in Gen 5 OU, among the few playstyles that could really match weather teams in viability. Well, some of these Dragmag teams used Scarf Politoed, but that was more because Sandrush, Excadrill, and Permanent Sand was absolutely nightmarish otherwise, and when Sandville Garchomp was allowed in OU, one could never be too safe against that either. That still didn't make them rain teams. Anyway, Magnezone of course enabled several non-dragons as well, meaning it wasn't solely restricted to Dragmag teams. It helped Scizor once again, Sandrush Excadrill on Sand, and most notably, the newly buffed with Icicle Crash Mamoswine, whose Ice Shard made it a superb dragon revenge killer as well, and thus made it a popular inclusion on Dragmag teams. Mostly though, it was all about the dragons, and boy were they terrifying. Familiar faces most of them, Latios, Garchomp, a newly buffed multi-scale Dragonite whose Choice Band Extreme Speed was almost as good as its Outrage, but the scariest of them all, at least in terms of raw power, was the newcomer Haxorus, whose Choice Band Outrage was unprecedented in its ferocity. It was practically unleashing Rayquaza level power on the tier. With Magnezone removing the few steals that could stand in its way, Haxorus was a one-hit KO machine, and the sheer power of the strategy propelled it to become one of OU's defining team styles even after Garchomp's ban. That was pretty much Magnezone's gig. Simple, not flashy, but consistent, and important in what it did. In the post-Excadrill and Thundurus metagame, it eventually started seeing more use on sand teams, especially once Deoxys Speed left the tier as well. It was usually seen alongside Swords Dance, Acrobatics, Flying Gem, Gliscor, making that monster even more terrifying. It was great alongside Sandforce, Landorus Incarnate, and sometimes even Stoutland. The release of Moxie Salamence also saw Scarf Ments pop up in usage, and Magnezone was of course great support for it, leading a Dragmag resurgence. Magnezone usage slowed down in Black and White 2 as the #1 steel threat became Genesect, a Pokemon Magnezone generally wanted no part of, and the offensive focus of the tier generally revolved around Pokemon that didn't need Magnezone support at all. Tornadus Therian, Keldeo, Sheer Force Landorus Incarnate, and Technetium Breloom, among others. However, several bans and a developing metagame later, some players exploring their options came to realize that Dragmag was poised to make a comeback, and indeed, it came roaring back with a vengeance. Garchomp had been unbanned with Black and White 2's release of Rough Skin, and it was making a case for itself as the best Scarfer in the tier, and that was often on teams without direct anti-Skarmory support. With Magnezone in the picture, it was downright ferocious. Dragon Dance Dragonite was scarier than ever, especially with the rise of Yachtberry to make revenge killing it even more difficult. Players were rediscovering the insane brokenness of Specs Latios, while also appreciating how great Life Orb Starmie could be, not just because it spun for Dragonite's multiscale, but because of how terrifying it was without Ferrothorn in the picture. Landorus Therian was also an effective Pokemon of such playstyles, whether with Choice Scarf or a double boosting set, while Mamoswine and Salamence remained vicious, and even Trick Room Uniclus proved a fierce late game cleaning option. The new Black and White 2 added Big Gun though, that really kickstarted the renewed interest in the playstyle, and one that no respectable Dragmag team would be seen without was Kyurem Black. Previously dismissed for the lackluster consistency of its potential heavy but matchup reliant mixed sets, players realized that the way to run it was with Magnezone support and Choice Band. Get those steals out of the way, and those steals that it doesn't melt with sheer power anyway, and watch as Choice Band Kyurem Black drops opponents with outrages that make Rayquaza look UU by comparison. It was simple, brutal, and beautiful. As the style saw new usage and more success than ever, Magnezone adopted a new set for optimal Ferrothorn KOing by running Sunny Day. It would replace any potential rain and one-hit KO Ferrothorn on the following turn, limiting the spikes it would stack, to say nothing of removing any worries of being leech stalled. Additionally, it enjoyed Chople Berry as its item, which at high enough health, thanks to its good bulk, nullified attempts from Alakazam, Keldeo, and Terrakion to revenge kill it. As Excadrill became more common, Air Balloon and Magnet Rise also saw usage. As with Sunny Day, Magnezone would actually be able to trap Excadrill if it managed to switch in with its balloon intact, making its steel trapping reach even wider. Sand balance teams also started enjoying Magnezone more, facilitating specially defensive Swords Dance Gliscor sweeps quite well. However, its true home was always Drag Mag. All in all, Magnezone was an enormous part of OU once more in Gen 5. Magneton dropped to the new RU tier, and there it was excellent, as it was both a solid steel trapper and a big threat in its own right. It was so good with these that it wound up being one of the very best Pokemon in the meta. Its steel trapping capabilities were on prime display against another one of the scariest Pokemon in the tier, Durant. Choice sets would get picked off by any Magneton variant should they lock into their stabs, while Scarf Magneton could pivot into and pick off non-choice sets before they could unleash superpower. However, Magneton was generally at its best with the choice spec set, which still helped against Durant, but whose power let it take out the tier's other steals much more easily. Its massively strong HP Fire shredded Steelix from incredibly high health, while also utterly destroying Escavalier and Pharisee. Meanwhile, Thunderbolt cleanly dropped Aggron despite the move's neutrality. This was incredible support for a team to have. Most notably, it enabled Druddigon to spam Choice Band Outrage and thrash the rest of the tier with ease, while it was also effective in helping something like Acrobatics Flying Gem Sceptile or Scarf Durant clean up late game. Magneton was thus a fixture on many offense teams, but it wasn't just because it was supporting these other threats. It was also brutally difficult for the tier's popular balance team to withstand on its own. Its stab combination trucked through much of the tier. The tier's grounds Golurk and Rhydon were generally terrified of Flash Cannon, and even the resistant Steelix was 3-hit KO'd from full, and even specially defensive Torterra needed to be in perfect condition to take 2 of them, while of course fearing Hidden Power Fire. If you didn't have the rare Seismitoad, you feared Magneton greatly. With grounds reluctant to switch in, Magneton was free to spam its electric stab. Yes, Thunderbolt, but more irritatingly, Volt Switch, which chunked resists like Roselia, Amoonguss, Druddigon, and Rotomo, with Stealth Rock's help before forcing them out immediately with a threat that it allowed Magneton to bring in. These resists were also unable to check Magneton safely over the course of the game. Again, note the weaknesses to HP Fire and the neutralities to Flash Cannon. Furthermore, Magneton's nice bulk and resist ensured it had plenty of switch-in opportunities against the plethora of bulky Pokemon in the tier, steel trapping, wall breaking, and providing momentum for his teammates to ensure the offensive attack never ceased. Yep, Magneton was an amazing Pokemon in Gen 5 RU. Magnezone wasn't a VGC Pokemon at all, with its Heatran-esque weaknesses alongside much worse speed and not the same level of bulk or especially offensive threat in return. Thus, the only placement we could find for it across 2012 or 2013 was trainer Blake, rocking it to 4th place in the junior division of the 2013 Australian Nationals. Good job, Blake. You put Magnezone on the board beyond singles. Gen 6's introduction of fairy types meant steels were no longer the only ones capable of withstanding the dragon onslaught. Did this mean Magnezone slowed down? Nope, not at all. Dragons were still fearsome, with Latios in particular being one of the best Pokemon around, while Garchomp, Dragonite, and Kyurem Black saw plenty of use throughout XY too. Plus, Skarmory and Ferrothorn were still incredibly important targets to remove in general, as was the newly mega Scizor, and it wasn't just the dragons that benefited from their removal. It was those same newly added fairy types. Azumarill, for instance, was an absolute terror with Magnezone support, as was Clefable. The air balloon Magnet Rise actually originated here in Gen 6, and it inspired its use in Black and White, as Excadrill was incredibly common, and being able to remove it was superb for Clefable. Funnily enough, Magnezone was also quite decent into Clefable itself, with its fairy resistance and super effective stab Flash Cannon. Early on in the overly fast and high-powered OU metagame, Magnezone's support was a bit superfluous, so it actually dropped to UU, but it absolutely throttled the tier and was quick banned. Then, some bans under OU's belt, the metagame settled down, and Magnezone's talents were needed once again, so it rose back up from BL. Beyond fairy and dragon types, Magnezone's support was highly appreciated by Diggersby, as well as that brand new Mega Scizor and the frighteningly powerful Mega Pinsir. Funnily enough, if running Scarf, Zone was actually quite a good check to Mega Pinsir, while also gaining new revenge killing utility against major threats in matchups that had now flipped, like those against Keldeo, Thundurus, and Megazard Y. It was also incredibly important to take on the offensive Mega Scizor that rose near the end of XY. Despite the nerf to Hidden Power and Thunderbolt's base powers, Magnezone still got the job done, appreciating the lack of permanent rain that let it take Ferrothorn out even when running Scarf Zone, which could assist against the terrifying Mega Mawile before it was banned. Oraz came around, and spike stacking teams with Skarmory and Ferrothorn really took off as the player base realized just how limp Defog was as an anti-hazard measure, ensuring Magnezone's continued usage. It was supporting new, terrifying Megas too, with Metagross, Diancie, and Altaria being especially ferocious with Skarmory and Ferrothorn out of the picture. A newly buffed Weavile was also a particularly fierce Magnezone partner. Some years later, when Mega Metagross began terrorizing the tier, Scarf Magnezone saw a major uptick in usage. Of course, Mega Metagross was too bulky to be taken out from full health, of course, but Magnezone was so excellent against it because it could pivot into most of its moves and get guaranteed free significant chip damage on it with Volt Switch, which was majorly helpful, especially in conjunction with something like Rocky Helmet, Garchomp, or Landorus. In isolation, neither of these Pokemon would be sufficient, but together they got the job done nicely. Eventually, Scarf Zone started running Thunder Wave to really ensure it would permanently ruin Mega Metagross if it had to. Of course, Magnezone was also a great Mega Metagross partner, and the two began seeing major use together, alongside another threat that was defining the metagame at the time and loved Magnezone's Skarmory removing ability, especially defensive Gliscor. As such, Magnezone balanced teams of all sorts thrived. Even stalled teams began enjoying Magnezone's talents, as removing the spikes and defog capabilities of opposing Skarmory gave them a major advantage, while the Scarf set speed gave a nice general revenge killer against major offensive threats like Mega Medicham. Magnezone made a particularly nice speedy trapping core, alongside the Choice Band Weavile it was such a good supporter of, that also featured prominently on balance and stall teams. Overall, the 6 was another superb generation for Magnezone. Magneton returned to RU and it was excellent there once more, but this time it didn't even bother using Magnet Pull, as it wasn't going to be trapping Registeel, and while the idea of trapping Escavalier and Bronzong was nice, it wasn't necessary and definitely didn't outweigh the main benefit of the ability it chose, Analytic, which provided the equivalent of a Life Orb boost when Magneton attacked the Pokemon switching in, or if Magneton moved second in a turn, but that was a situation you wanted to avoid. Put it this way, remember how Gen 5 Specs Magneton was a threat in its own right? Forget trapping steals, it's all about spamming those terrifying stabs with occasional help from hidden power, to it killing pretty much anything that wants it to switch in. Well, that's what you have here, except the first hit you get on the switch is much stronger thanks to Analytic. As such, Magneton was one of the scariest wall breakers in the tier, a highly valuable trait given how defining a playstyle balance was. Magneton would use its terrific typing to switch in, and once it had done that, there was nothing safe from its assault. Even the few Pokemon that resisted both stabs were effortlessly dispatched by the corresponding hidden power, which usually targeted the Volt Switch immune, like Steelix, both Mega when it was in the tier and Base afterwards, and Mega Camerupt were doused by hidden power water, while Seismitoad and Lantern loathed hidden power grass. The tier's best, most popular ground, Flygon, was already mortally scared of Flash Cannon, while Rhyperior feared both Flash Cannon and either choice of hidden power. Everything else you could Volt Switch on and wear down, and Specs Analytic Volt Switch was just downright insane. It took skill to wield to its full potential, but those meta-defining Alomomola Venusaur cores were just a few Magneton moves away from being disassembled. Magneton was great once again in Gen 6. Magnezone, despite still being highly flawed, had its resistances seen as a bit more valuable in Gen 6 VGC, especially in relation to its solid capabilities of threatening rain and fairy types. Destroying Mega Mawile was particularly nice, and thus, even though it still wasn't really part of the metagame at all, it managed to find a few neat placements. In 2014, they were Cameron Kissick, 16th at the Virginia Regionals, and James, 9th at the Melbourne Regionals. Then in 2015, Alfredo CG got 2nd at the Junior Division in the Australian Nationals. Magnezone's Magnet Pull talents took center stage against a brand new Pokemon eshabilishing itself as OU's premier steel flying type, Celesteela. It had to be more careful than against Skarmory, since Celesteela packed Leech Seed, Flamethrower, and a much higher special defense stat. But the efforts would be well worth it for all the threats it would enable. Magnezone's steel trapping reach went beyond Celesteela, of course. Getting rid of Ferrothorn was as major as ever, as was Mega Scizor. This time around, Magnezone was also tasked with getting rid of some major offensive threats too, and not just offensive Mega Scizor. We're talking Kartana, and this time a much greater emphasis on Mega Mawile. With Sucker Punch's nerf to 70 base power, and Magnezone's ability to power itself up with Z-moves, as it quite often did with Gigavolt Havoc to ensure it could blast through Celesteela, Magnezone was a much more reliable method of forcibly removing the massive danger that was Mega Maw, and could even substitute to dodge Sucker Punch and really seal the deal if needed. As such, Magnezone balance teams were quite effective, as they were not just having the threats enabled, but having one of their biggest opposing threats removed too. As for Kartana, any zone set would trap a choice variant locked into stab or knockoff, but Scarf Zone was the most reliable for teams that really needed Kartana gone, as standard Z Zone was destroyed by Swords Dance sets with either boosted Sacred Sword or unboosted all-out pummeling. Beyond this threat checking, Magnezone was enabling a scarier cast of characters than ever. Imagine the following Pokemon: Kartana, Tapu Bulu, Tapu Lele, Mega Alakazam, Mega Latios, Mega and Base Garchomp, Offensive Landorus, Offensive Tornadus, Mega Scizor, Protean, and Battle Bond Greninja, Swords Dance Gliscor, Kyurem Black, Superior, Mega Diancie. We'll stop there. But yeah, those are among the scariest threats in OU. And now imagine you can't use Ferrothorn, Celesteela, or Mega Scizor to stop them, or the rare Skarmory for that matter. Magnezone enables so many of the biggest threats, often used in conjunction, to insane extremes. Once again, it was a superb supportive force, and when using Steelium Z over its usual Electrium, could even crush a ground type or Kommo-o, switching in thinking itself safe. Meanwhile, Magneton moved up to UU despite not receiving any buffs, which is always nice to see. This was because of UU's steel types, which were significant forces and whose removal would be excellent support. support. The biggest one was the controversial, highly dangerous Scizor, whose proclivity for spamming U-turn seemed like it'd make Magneton's trapping task difficult, but that was nothing an eject button teammate like a Lomomola or a Moongus couldn't fix, guaranteeing mag safe entry and Scizor's removal. Seeing as Scizor was dangerous to the point of being considered broken, this was superb support. Magneton wasn't just removing Scizor either, it also safely removed one of UU's most reliable pillars of support, Empoleon. To make matters even better, it completely dominated Klefki as well, and could even finish off Mega Aggron and Mega Steelix in the 50 to 60% range. This anti-steal support was terrific for enabling some of UU's best Pokemon. Latias, Mega Altaria, Mega Aerodactyl, Hydreigon, Terrakion, Togekiss, Primarina, Nihilego, they all loved it. Here was the problem. This type of support, while certainly very nice, was far from necessary, and UU was so power crept that Magneton, with its now poor bulk and unimpressive speed, generally struggled to find use in doing anything that wasn't its steel trapping duties. Heck, while it took on Empoleon and Klefki just fine, it needed very specific teammates to reliably answer Scizor, its most important target, and while this wasn't bad, it also meant Magneton would be relegated to just that, being specific. The fact it needed serious chip to take on the Mega Steals didn't help, and it couldn't even trap one of the most common steals in Doublade, since its half ghost typing prevented it from being trapped by abilities. Magneton was certainly a decent UU Pokemon with a legitimate place in the tier, just not one that would be seen too often. Finally, Magnezone was actually quite solid in the 2017 VGC metagame. Most notably, it completely dominated the Celesteela that otherwise walled almost everything in its path. This was incredible support for Tapu Lele, who was on a major portion of Magnezone teams. If it wasn't Lele, it was Bulu. Also massively enjoying the anti-Celesteela support was the excellent Garchomp. Magnezone also had solid matchups against the Tapus and did quite well into Mimikyu, making it a generally reliable Pokemon against the metagame at large. It found quite a number of solid placements as a result, and they were Zoe Liu and Alex Gomez, 1st and 19th respectively, at Melbourne International, Christian Frank, 8th at the Malmo Regional, Auguste Chico, 6th at the Buenos Aires Regional, and 4th at the Buenos Aires Special Event, Christian Jaramillo, 3rd at the Bogota Special Event, Riley Factura, 5th at the Salt Lake Regional, Anahi Vicente, Juan Pablo Martinez, and Alan Paz, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th respectively at the Azacian Special Event, Diego Gutierrez, 5th at the Lima Special Event, Ruben Pereira, 8th at the Bilbao Special Event, Sandy Martinez, 4th at the Daytona Beach Regional, Alex Gomez, 2nd at the London International, and Ing Young Jing, 1st at the Kuala Lumpur Special Event. Sadly, in 2018, the Pokedex expanded and Magnezone disappeared completely, but hey, a legitimate season of VGC under its belt at long last. Upon arriving in Generation 8's Isle of Armor DLC, Magnezone losing hidden power seemed like a blow at first. How would it deal with Ferrothorn? Fortunately, this wouldn't be an issue, as Magnezone also received Body Press. With a boost from Iron Defense, Ferrothorn would be just as dealt with as it had always been. As such, Magnezone once again had a defining role in OU, removing Ferrothorn and the resident Steel Flying type, or types this time around. Corviknight and Skarmory were the two in the fray. Funnily enough, Magnezone actually had to be somewhat careful around Corviknight and Skarmory, given their own propensity to run Iron Defense Body Press, but generally it was incredibly reliable because it was itself quite solid in the physical defense department and the fact that it was generally faster. Using Magnezone was simple. It'd run Iron Defense Body Press if it needed to remove Ferrothorn, and Choice Specs if it didn't, which let it act as a powerful threat in its own right. And if it really wanted to run Specs and still do something to Ferrothorn, it could still run Body Press to decent effect. As such, Magnezone excelled because of the teammates it enabled. It was a particular superb supporter of the dangerous Choice Band Rillaboom, which also helped it get on the field with U-turn. Speaking of switch moves, this was an especially defining feature of Gen 8 OU offense, and Magnezone had them in abundance. Oh yes, plural, as it wasn't just Volt Switch anymore, though that with Specs was quite a stinger. If it wasn't running Body Press last, it could opt for the buff Teleport, allowing it to scout opponent switches and provide its teammates a safe switch-in without being stuffed by ground types. Then the Crown Tundra DLC came around, and the number of enormous threats Magnezone could support skyrocketed even further. Once again, it had the dynamic where it both supported its own Kartana and could trap the opponents, while it also had a similar dynamic with the controversial new beast Melmetal. Also returning for more zone-supported goodness were Tapu Lele and Garchomp, which became even more threatening than they already were, with their biggest roadblocks removed. The monstrous Weavile really loved Magnezone support, especially as Magnezone could power through the occasional Scizor wonderfully as well. All the switch moves flying around in Gen 8 like Dragapult, Landorus Therian, Tornadus Therian, and Rillaboom's U-turn ensured Magnezone had plenty of opportunity to hit the field to not just trap its target, but to advance the game state either with its big spec stabs that threatened many common defensive staples, the tier's grounds notably really disliking boosted flash cannons, with even Spadef Landorus Therian not particularly enjoying them, or to simply continue the switch move chain itself as part of the positioning that was so defining for the tier. Yet again, Magnezone did Magnezone things wonderfully and was a tremendous Pokemon in Gen 8 OU. Meanwhile, power creep pushed Magneton further down than it ever been before, all the way to PU, but there it was outstanding. defending. It didn't bother with steel trapping. It was just a massive wall-breaking threat with its specs boosted attacks, augmented further on the many switches it caused with Analytic. The tier simply got dissected by its stabs. The Pokemon that checked it were pretty much, Lantern and Togedemaru. End of list. Everything else got utterly mauled. Even resist to its stabs like Ferroseed and Vikavolt were severely flawed because they got Volt switched on, number 1, got overwhelmed by the sheer strength of Magneton's attacks, number 2, and number 3, didn't exactly threaten Magneton in return. Quagsire resisted both stabs too, but it got blown away by Magneton's last move, Tri-Attack, which also crushed Vikavolt. Everything else got blasted apart. Flash Cannon was particularly free in smashing the common cores of Sandslash, Eldegoss, Gigalith, and Rabombi. Additionally, Magneton's many resists and good bulk let it take advantage of common Pokemon like Whimsicott and Rabombi, ensuring plenty of opportunity. It wasn't as good against offensive teams peppered with Pokemon like Gallade and Charizard, but in terms of wall breaking, it was absolutely incredible. Magneton also technically had niches in UU and NU, but it was far more effective on paper than in practice. Actually pulling off a Scizor trap in UU was too convoluted to be worthwhile most of the time, though on occasion it could be decent, while in NU it could potentially support Calm Mind Sylveon with a Charge Beam Iron Defense set that was meant to trap Copperajah, Stakataka, and Escavalier. Sometimes. Yeah, this was niche. There's a reason Magneton went to PU. There it was really at home, cementing a major spot for itself and making Gen 8 another success. Magnezone was largely back to its general uselessness in Gen 8 VGC, but despite its lack of meta niche, it still scraped together a few placements from its generally decent inherent traits. At the 2020 Pokemon Trainers Cup, one Silk Jang reached second with it, while at the 2020 Japan Decisive Battle, Takuto Nodohara also reached second with it. That's it, and there aren't many details to speak of, besides both players pairing Magnezone with Togekiss, Dragapult, and of course Incineroar, but hey, it's something for Zone. You might be thinking at this point, wow, Magnezone's had an incredible run. OU every gen since its introduction. With those steel trapping capabilities, it feels like an inherent part of the tier so long as steel flying types and Ferrothorn are around. Yeah, well, to that we say brace yourself for what can only be called a Gen 9 moment. Magnezone is not OU this time around. Not even close. There is simply nothing to trap. Corviknight? Why would one need to trap it when it is so utterly dominated by Goldango? Goldango has eclipsed Magnezone's duties in that it prevents Corviknight from ever doing anything of worth, while also being much better against the metagame as a whole with its stats, typing, and move pool. Oh yeah, and Goldango is also a steel that, thanks to its half ghost typing, can't be trapped by Magnezone either. Now, what Zone can potentially do is undeniably nifty. Having a chance at trapping the mighty King Gambit is nothing to sneer at. However, it's also not that huge, because it's not like King Gambit is a major wall, and also, King Gambit tends to terastallize a lot, and then you forget about trapping the steel because it's not a steel anymore. And thus, Magnezone quickly dropped to UU, and there it was solid because of how effortlessly it trapped Tinkaton, whose Gigaton Hammer bounced off and who lacked any method to really threaten Magnezone, while terastallizing just to escape was not the most optimal use of the mechanic, and unless done on the switch to Magnezone would still result in Magnezone smacking it very hard before Tinkaton was able to switch, making the whole endeavor even more pointless. This was a classic case of Magnezone support and how it enabled several big threats, most notably the Fairy-type Calm Mind Sweepers Florges and Sylveon, who were generally incredibly difficult to KO, and who relished in the lack of Tinkaton to the point of practically becoming immortal in its absence. Then the Teal Mask DLC arrived, and Magnezone dropped far further, all the way down to NU. It actually had some decent trapping capabilities in RU though. It was able to remove high-value Pokemon in Empoleon and Fortress. However, the fact that it failed to trap the high-horsepowering running Revavroom and another common steel in Cobalion, in addition to the fact that Empoleon and Fortress weren't exactly immovable walls, even despite Empoleon gaining Roost, made players question the necessity of the whole affair, which is why Magnezone's usage in the tier was sparse. In NU though, Magnezone is quite good. Like Magneton on several occasions before it, Magnezone now dispenses with any steel trapping pretense in the tier where the steel count is low, and Registeel isn't the kind of Pokemon you'd use Magnezone to trap anyway. Thus, Magnezone has now found new purpose as a Specs wall breaker with Analytic. Its Volt Switches and Thunderbolts are fearsome because the tier's grounds tremble before Flash Cannon, the go-to option. Flygon just drops, as do Rhyperior and Crocodile. Quagsire not only takes heavy damage from Flash Cannon, it actually gets 2-hit KO by Terra Blast just straight up. No need for Magnezone to Terra at all. Plus, if it really needs to, Magnezone can Terra Grass and instantly delete both Quagsire and Gastrodon. It's a solid Terra Grass user in general because of how it completely flips its quadruple Earthquake weakness into a resist, while also removing its fighting weakness against Mean Shao, Gallade, and Lucario. With switch moves aplenty in the tier, getting Magnezone on the field is quite effortless, and it of course contributes to the switch move effort itself with its massive Volt Switches. It's been quite a harsh drop for Magnezone, but at least it's found excellent use in its new home. As for Magneton, well, if Magnezone has dropped this low, it probably shouldn't come as a surprise that Magneton is out of the picture completely. It was a decent Pokemon in early NU, with a solid Eviolite set using enhanced bulk to take advantage of its resistances against offensive threats like Bruxish, Jolteon, and Scyther, letting it launch analytic boost boosted stabs, and potentially Terra Blast Fairy for Appleton and Umbreon, or Grass for Sandaconda and Wishcash. With grounds unable to safely block his Volt Switch, Magneton would then be an effective part of Volt Turn Change alongside Bombardier, Scyther, and Passimian. It was quite solid, but then the Teal Mask DLC came around and Magneton dropped out of the picture completely, unable to salvage a niche even in a power crept PU. However, since it's not a fully evolved Pokemon, it doesn't fall into the category of untiered. How excellent. Now Gen 9 also introduced a Paradox form from Magneton called Sandy Shocks, and it has also been quite solid. It's no longer half steel but half ground, a type combination previously only seen on Unova Stunfisk, but Sandy Shocks has the stats and move pool to actually get use out of it. Stats wise, it actually resembles an evolution to Magneton more than the kind of hyper min-max Paradox forms that are the norm, as all of its stats are better. It's much bulkier with a major HP increase to base 85 as opposed to Magneton's 50, a slight base defense increase with 97 as opposed to Magneton's 95, and a major special defense increase with 85 as opposed to 70. It's actually got even more special bulk than Magnezone, with only slightly less special defense and much more HP. Sandy Shocks is also functionally just as strong as Magneton. It's got base 121 special attack as opposed to Magneton's 120, so you can say technically it's stronger, but this lack of upgrade is more than made up for the fact that Sandy Shocks is fast. Not only is it much faster than Magneton, its base 101 speed stat is genuinely good in its own right. It's the same as the vaunted Landorus Incarnate, beating out the famed base 100 benchmark. Of course, Sandy Shocks also differs from its magnetic cousins in that it does not have Magnapole as its ability. As past Paradox Pokemon, it of course has Photosynthesis, giving it the opportunity to boost upon switching in. Usually it'll EV itself so it's boosting its speed, giving it an excellent method of threatening in the late game. Sandy Shocks also has a much different move pool, Trusty Stab, Volt Switch, and Thunderbolt carried over, but beyond that it looks very different. Its secondary stab is Earth Power, excellent for dusting seals and opposing electrics, but it really distinguishes itself with the bevy of utility offered by its access to Stealth Rock and Spikes. Sandy Shocks took these talents and settled into a solid niche in UU. It was very strong in the metagame's early stages, as it was among the stronger, faster Pokemon around, outrunning several other top Pokemon like Staraptor and Salamence, while it excelled defensively against metastaples like Talonflame, Tinkaton, and Scizor. Sandy Shocks' solid but relatively limited stab coverage was a simple Terra Blast away from being fixed to brutal effect, i.e. Terra Blast Grass against Gastrodon in true Magneton family fashion, though it was also very effective with Terra Ice for a superb pseudo Bolt Beam effect, letting it rip through another check in Woshian. Both Terra types made its Volt Switches seriously tough to block, while heavy duty boots ensured opposing hazards wouldn't be a problem. While Sandy Shocks was also stacking its own, it was primarily used as a sort of offensive threat slash pivot, a great part of a Volt Turn chain both for its own Volt Switch and the spikes that is stacked, enhancing the power of such moves. Even if you could block its Volt Switch, it simply get a layer of spikes before switching out. It was incredibly effective on just about any form of team since it had such great use both offensively and defensively, and was nearly impossible to stop from making some form of progress almost no matter what. Eventually, controversially so. It wound up receiving a suspect test, with many claiming Terastallizing allowing it to delete its answers made it far too good at doing what it was already good at doing, especially since it had plenty of diversity to its Terra. Not only did the Grass versus Ice conundrum already force numerous answers from opposing teams, like pairing Gastrodon with Woshian, Sandy Shocks could also do things like Terra Ground and give serious heft to its Earth powers. However, Sandy Shocks wound up not being banned, as Terastallizing also came with the unpleasant drawback of making Sandy Shocks far worse off into the Talonflame, Tinkaton, and Scizor that it was so valued for being able to check. Pokemon Home came around, and Sandy Shocks actually rose to OU for some time. It was deceptively consistent, offering teams quite a bit of utility despite its downright restrained stats by OU standards. It was known to be a worthwhile boots, Volt Switch, Spikes pivot from fairly early on, potentially even going for speed boosting with booster energy, or even on Sun teams. Its ground stab extremely valuable in a metagame so dominated by Goldango and King Gambit, but what kickstarted its rise to OU was taking on a new role, using booster energy for a speed boost, but in the lead position. It was excellent on a highly successful hyper offense team, getting quick Stealth Rock and leaving a great deal of damage strewn in its wake, which was excellent for the onslaught of boosting sweepers which would follow it. This team became quite popular and was a major contributor to Shocks rising to OU. However, this niche wasn't the most permanent thing, and a few months later, Shocks found itself having returned to UU. It always technically had a niche in OU afterwards, but wasn't used much at all. In UU, it continued as it had previously, though now it was less controversial and mostly just a very solid Pokemon. Stab Earth Power was highly effective, with most flying types so fearful of Electric Stab, and it had plenty of versatility and utility with which to brandish it. It was also particularly effective on Sun teams as well. However, as the DLCs rolled in and the metagame progressed, Sandy Shocks, while never becoming bad, saw its stats become less impressive against stronger, faster, bulkier competition. competition. The presence of Thunderous Tyrion, which was just as fast, hit much harder and completely blanked both of Shox' stabs, forcing it to run Power Gem, which didn't help. Of course, Sandy Shock's hazard utility ensured it always had a good place in the meta, just not nearly as good as in early parts of the generation. It was still a solid debut and addition to Magneton's family's competitive history. It's actually the most successful of the three in Gen 9 by far. In 2023, Magnezone has, despite still not being a part of the meta, managed to put together some placements. It's not spectacular or anything, but sometimes some good stats, typing, and move pool can carry you pretty far, even if you're not specifically geared to take on your surroundings. Its placements were Renzo Navarro 8th and Sebastian Bisbal 9th, Santiago Regionals. Sebastian also reached 4th at the Lima Special Event, where Renzo also reached 6th. Roberto Peretti reached 3rd at the Torino Special Event, and Giovanni Aranibar reached 18th at the Milwaukee Regionals. Sandy Shox wasn't much good either, not having anything particularly impressive to offer. Though Photosynthesis offered more, it still wasn't all that much. It still notched some placements, though most notably, Dylan Salvanera 3rd at the Vancouver Regionals, and Jefferson Carmelo 4th at the NATO Regionals. Additionally, Christian Smiljanik reached 12th at the Utrecht Special Event, and Wolf Glick reached 13th at the Charlotte Regionals. And now we can finally answer the question, so how great were Magneton, Magnezone, and Sandy Shox actually? Well, after having waded through an absolute magnum megaton of information, we can safely say that both of them have been absolutely stellar. Magneton had a subpar Gen 1, but picked things up in Gen 2 and went on an amazing streak. It was great in Gen 2 UU, an incredibly important part of Gen 3 OU, had a legitimate role in Gen 4 OU and NU, tore up Gens 5 and 6 of RU, actually rose back up to UU in Gen 7, dropped to a PU tier it shredded in Gen 8, and then finally ran out of steam in Gen 9. It only took the most power crept tier in history to slow it, a not fully evolved Pokemon. Meanwhile, Magnezone had an absolutely incredible streak, solidly OU from its debut in Generation 4 all the way through 8, aside from the briefest of forays into UU, where it got banned and then rose back to OU almost before anyone even had time to blink. It too finally dropped off in Gen 9, first doing well in UU, then going all the way down to NU, where it excels today. Oh, and it also had a serious niche in Gen 4 Ubers too. Both Pokemon are renowned for their steel trapping ability Magnet Pull, which forms the crux of their viability and how they enable some of the scariest Pokemon around to the heights of their potential, but have also demonstrated time and time again their excellence in their own right, especially in more modern generations where Magnezone dispenses with Magnet Pull entirely and blasts away with analytic boosted attacks. They're not much of a VGC presence, but Magnezone had a good 2017 season at least. Meanwhile, Sandy Shox has been the best of the three in Gen 9 in both singles and VGC. It was excellent in early UU, almost banned, even before briefly rising to OU, then continuing its solid UU placement for the rest of the gen, while grabbing some good VGC finishes as well. Overall, Magneton, Magnezone, and Sandy Shox have been absolutely incredible in the competitive scene. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Don Creek, Eric Dissing, Espion Lover, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Game Slayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Palamute, Schmooter, Seagulls Incorporated, Soljiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soros and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Tyler, Kiboflu, Wardine, Zathor for their major support of our videos.